Some men do not survive loss. They simply continue breathing. The storm rolled over Blackwood Castle like a living thing, wind clawing at the ancient stone as if trying to tear it apart. Yet inside, nothing moved, nothing lived, not truly, because for 5 long years, Duke Sebastian Blackwood had turned his world into a place where even light seemed unwelcome, where footsteps echoed too loudly and laughter had long since been forgotten, and the servants who remained spoke in hushed voices, careful not to disturb the silence he wore like armor, because everyone knew the same truth whispered beyond the iron gates. The Duke was not cruel, but he was unreachable, a man carved from grief so deep it had hollowed him out until only duty remained. That evening, he stood before the tall windows of his study, staring out at the endless stretch of rain-soaked grounds, his reflection faint in the glass, barely recognizable even to himself, because the man he had once been no longer existed, buried somewhere beneath memories he refused to revisit. Memories locked away behind a door no one dared approach, not even him, not anymore. Somewhere below, the heavy front doors creaked open against the storm, an unfamiliar sound in a place where nothing ever changed. And though he did not turn, though he told himself it did not matter, something in the air shifted, subtle and unwelcome, like the faintest crack in a wall he had spent years building. Eliza Whitmore stepped inside with rain clinging to her coat, her boots worn from miles of walking, her hands cold but steady as she faced the vast entrance hall that seemed too large, too quiet, too lifeless for a place meant to be lived in. Yet she did not hesitate, not even when the butler's doubtful eyes measured her from head to toe, not even when the storm howled behind her like a warning she chose to ignore, because she had nowhere else to go, and something about the stillness of this place felt less like fear and more like a challenge. Upstairs, Sebastian's fingers tightened slightly against the stone window frame, a reaction so small it would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But it was there, undeniable, because for the first time in years, the silence of Blackwood Castle had been interrupted, and it did not immediately disappear. By morning, the storm had not passed, but something else had settled over Blackwood Castle, something quieter, more deliberate, as if the walls themselves were listening, and Eliza Whitmore moved through the vast corridors with careful steps, not out of fear, but out of respect for the silence that lived there, her fingers brushing lightly against the cold stone as she followed the butler through halls that seemed to stretch endlessly, each room more untouched than the last, as though time itself had slowed. Within these walls, she was given simple instructions, clear and without warmth, to remain unseen, to speak only when necessary, to disturb nothing that belonged to the Duke, especially the Upper West Wing, a place the staff mentioned only in lowered voices, and Eliza listened, nodding once, because she understood rules. She had lived by them her entire life. Yet there was something in the way they spoke, something that felt less like authority and more like fear, and she had never believed. Fear was something that should be obeyed blindly. Upstairs, Sebastian Blackwood remained in his study long after the sun had risen, though the light barely touched the interior, filtered thin and gray through heavy clouds, and he told himself that the unfamiliar presence below meant nothing, that servants came and went as they always had, that nothing in his world had changed, yet his thoughts returned, uninvited, to the sound of the door opening the night before, to the quiet persistence of someone who had stepped inside despite the storm, despite the unspoken warning this place carried, and he found himself irritated by the memory, by the fact that it lingered at all. Hours passed, and the rhythm of the castle resumed, slow and muted, until a small disruption reached him, faint but unmistakable, a sound from the lower hall where no one lingered, and before he could dismiss it, his steps had already carried him to the staircase, each movement measured, controlled, until he paused at the final step and saw her for the first time in daylight, kneeling near a long-forgotten table, carefully straightening a row of extinguished candles as though they still held purpose, her movements unhurried, precise, as if she believed the room deserved to be tended even after years of neglect. He should have turned away, should have left without a word, because nothing she was doing mattered, because nothing here mattered anymore. But instead he remained, watching, studying the way she worked without seeking approval, without glancing over her shoulder to see if she was being observed, and when at last she rose, Her eyes lifted and met his, steady and clear, not startled, not apologetic, just aware, and in that brief, quiet moment, something unfamiliar passed between them, something that did not belong in a place like this. And for reasons he could not name, Sebastian did not speak, and neither did she. And the silence that followed felt different than the one he had known for years. There are silences that protect a man, and there are silences that expose him. And Sebastian Blackwood had lived within the first for so long that he did not recognize the second when it began to form around him, subtle and unwelcome, carried in the presence of a servant who did not lower her gaze the way the others did, who did not rush away the moment his shadow crossed the doorway. And as the day unfolded, he found himself aware of her in ways that unsettled him, not because she spoke or demanded attention, but because she did neither. Eliza Whitmore moved through the castle as if she belonged to no one and nothing, her steps quiet yet assured, her hands restoring small fragments of order to spaces long abandoned, polishing tarnished silver that had not reflected light in years, adjusting curtains that had been left drawn as though the outside world no longer deserved to be seen. And each task she completed left behind a faint trace of something unfamiliar, not warmth exactly, but the suggestion that warmth might one day return. By late afternoon, the sky had cleared enough for pale sunlight to press gently against the tall windows, and for the first time in years, one of them stood open, the heavy fabric pulled aside to allow the light to slip across the stone floor, and Sebastian noticed it immediately, the change too deliberate to ignore, his jaw tightening as he crossed the hall with measured steps, his gaze landing on the window as though it were an intrusion, rather than a relief. She was there, standing beside it, her hands resting lightly on the frame, her eyes lifted toward the gray horizon beyond the grounds, and for a moment, she seemed unaware of him entirely, as if the world outside held her attention more than the one she had entered, and something in that quiet disregard unsettled him more than defiance ever could. You were not instructed to open that. His voice cut through the stillness, low and controlled, yet carrying an edge that had sent others retreating without question. But Eliza did not startle, did not step back. She simply turned her head and met his gaze with the same steady calm she had shown before, the same absence of fear that refused to give him the distance he was accustomed to. It was dark. "Your Grace," she said, her voice soft but clear, not apologetic, not challenging, simply stating what she believed to be true. And for a brief moment, he said nothing, because the words were so simple they offered no ground for argument, no place to direct the frustration that had risen unbidden in his chest. "This house is meant to be kept as it is," he replied at last, though even as he spoke, the statement felt hollow, as if he were repeating something he no longer fully believed. And her gaze did not waver, did not drop, as though she saw the hesitation he had not intended to reveal. "With respect, Your Grace," she said quietly, "it does not have to remain that way." And the silence that followed was different from any that had existed in Blackwood Castle before, because it was not empty, it was waiting, and for the first time in years, Sebastian did not immediately turn away. Not everything that breaks a man shatters loudly. Some fractures are quiet, almost invisible, until someone dares to touch them. And as Sebastian Blackwood stood in that dim hall, watching the pale light stretch across the stone floor, he felt something dangerously close to that sensation, a pressure beneath the surface he had spent years keeping still, and it unsettled him more than anger ever had, because anger was familiar, predictable, safe. This was not. He turned away first, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had too much, because her words lingered in a way they should not have, echoing through a place where nothing was meant to echo anymore. And as he walked back toward his study, each step measured, each breath controlled, he told himself that this was a mistake, that allowing even the smallest change would invite something he had long since buried, something he had no intention of facing again. Yet below, Eliza did not move immediately after he left, her gaze lingering on the open window, on the thin line of light that cut through the dimness like a promise no one had asked for. And slowly, deliberately, she adjusted the curtain so it would not close again, not completely, leaving space for the outside world to remain, even if only in silence. The afternoon stretched on, and the castle resumed its quiet rhythm. But it was not the same, not entirely. because where there had once been untouched stillness, there were now small disruptions, barely noticeable, yet undeniable. A chair slightly repositioned, a table cleared of dust, a corridor that no longer felt abandoned, and each change was so subtle it could be dismissed, yet together, they formed something new, something Sebastian could not ignore no matter how firmly he tried. By evening, the fire in his study had burned low, casting long shadows against the walls as he stood before the sealed door at the far end of the room. The one place in the castle that remained exactly as it had been left, untouched, preserved, protected, and for a long moment, he did nothing, his hand hovering just short of the handle, as if the space between was something sacred, something dangerous, something that could not be crossed without consequence. Then, from beyond the door, or perhaps only from memory, he thought he heard something, not a sound exactly, but a feeling, a shift, and before he could stop himself, his fingers tightened slightly, not enough to open it, never that, but enough to remind him that it was still there, that everything he had locked away had not disappeared, only waited. Somewhere down the hall, a faint movement broke the stillness, soft footsteps passing without hesitation, without fear, and though he could not see her, he knew it was her, because no one else moved through this place, as if it still belonged to the living, and for reasons he refused to examine. He did not pull his hand away immediately, as if the presence of someone who did not understand his silence had made it just a little harder to hold on to it. There are moments when a man realizes that what he has protected for years may not be as secure as he believed, and that realization does not arrive with noise or chaos, but with something far more dangerous, something quiet enough to slip beneath his defenses without warning. And Sebastian Blackwood felt it the following morning, not in a single event, but in a series of small, impossible changes that refused to be ignored. The corridor outside his study no longer carried the same weight of abandonment. The air itself seemed less still, as though the castle had taken a breath it had long denied itself, and when he stepped into the hall, his gaze immediately found the source without needing to search, because she was there again, moving with that same steady purpose that neither demanded attention nor avoided it, arranging a small table near the window with a precision that suggested care rather than obligation, and it was that distinction that unsettled him most. "You have been given clear instructions." His voice cut through the quiet, sharper than before, not raised, but edged with something that demanded acknowledgement. And this time, Eliza turned fully toward him, her hands stilling as she met his gaze without hesitation, the light from the window catching in her expression in a way that made it impossible to read as either submission or defiance. "I have followed them, Your Grace," she replied, her tone even, respectful, yet carrying a certainty that did not retreat under pressure, and for a brief moment, that answer was enough to disrupt the argument he had already formed in his mind, because there was no direct disobedience in her words, only a quiet interpretation of boundaries he had assumed were absolute. "This house is not meant to change," he said, though the words sounded less certain the moment they left him, as though repetition had become his only defense, and Eliza did not interrupt, did not challenge him immediately. She simply looked at the space around them, at the light that now reached farther into the room than it had the day before, and then back at him, her expression unchanged. "It already has," she said softly, and the truth of it settled between them in a way that could not be dismissed, because he could see it himself, in the subtle shift of shadows, in the way the silence no longer felt entirely empty. Sebastian took a step forward. Then, closing the distance just enough to reassert the authority he had never needed to question before. Yet even as he did, something held him back from pushing further, from issuing the command that would end this quiet defiance entirely, and he did not understand why. Because nothing about her should have carried weight in his world. Nothing about a servant should have unsettled a man who had endured far worse without faltering. "You presume too much," he said at last, but the words lacked the finality they once would have held, and Eliza inclined her head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, as if she accepted the statement without surrendering to it. And that subtle difference lingered longer than anything she had said. When he turned away this time, it was not with certainty, not with the solid conviction that had guided him for years, but with something far more fragile. A hesitation that followed him back into his study, and remained there long after the door had closed, because for the first time since the world he knew had shattered, something within it was beginning to shift, and he was no longer certain he wanted it to stop. Some changes are so small they almost escape notice, and yet they are the most dangerous of all, because they do not demand permission. They simply exist, and by the third day, Sebastian Blackwood could no longer deny that something within his carefully preserved world had begun to move beyond his control, not in defiance, not in chaos, but in quiet persistence that refused to be undone. He found it in the details first, in the way the morning light lingered longer in the halls because the curtains were no longer drawn so tightly, in the faint scent of fresh air that replaced the heavy stillness he had grown accustomed to, in the subtle order that had begun to return to spaces long abandoned. And though each change could be dismissed on its own, together they formed something that pressed against the edges of his composure. He told himself it was temporary, that it would fade, as all things did, that the servant responsible would eventually learn her place or leave as the others had. Yet even as he formed these thoughts, he knew they rang hollow, because Eliza Whitmore had not shown a single sign of retreat. That afternoon, he encountered her again, not in the grand halls or near the windows she seemed determined to open, but in a quieter part of the castle, a corridor that led toward the west wing, where the air grew colder, heavier, where even the remaining staff rarely ventured. And the moment he saw her there, standing near a small table covered in dust, something sharp rose within him, immediate and undeniable. "You were told to avoid this part of the house." His voice carried more weight this time. Not raised, but final, the kind of tone that allowed no interpretation. And for the first time since her arrival, Eliza hesitated, not in fear, but in recognition of the boundary he had drawn, her gaze shifting briefly to the door at the end of the corridor, the one that remained closed, untouched, before returning to him. "I was cleaning, Your Grace," she said quietly, and though the words were simple, they did not fully answer the question he had not spoken, and he stepped closer, the distance between them narrowing until the silence itself seemed to tighten. "This area is not to be disturbed," he said, more firmly now, because this was different. This was not a matter of light or order or small changes that could be overlooked. This was something else entirely, something he had kept untouched for a reason he refused to explain. Eliza lowered her eyes then, but not in surrender, rather in thought, as if she understood that this was not a rule born of authority, but of something far more fragile. And when she spoke again, her voice was softer, more careful, as though she had stepped closer to something unseen. "Some things cannot be cleaned by leaving them alone," she said, and the words landed with a quiet force that caught him off guard, not because they challenged him openly, but because they reached towards something he had not allowed to be spoken, not even in his own mind. For a moment, neither of them moved, the air between them heavy with something unspoken, and then, without another word, Sebastian turned away, his steps measured, controlled, but not as certain as they had once been, because her words followed him, not loudly, not insistently, but with a persistence he could not silence. And as he walked back through the dim corridors of his own home, he realized with a clarity that unsettled him more than anything before it, that she was not simply changing the castle, she was beginning to reach the places within it he had sworn would remain untouched. There are truths a man can avoid for years, carefully stepping around them as if they do not exist, and then there are truths that begin to follow him, quiet and patient, until there is nowhere left to turn, and Sebastian Blackwood felt that presence now more than ever, not in the grand halls or the places already changed, but in the silence he returned to, the silence that no longer felt entirely his own. That night, the castle was still, the kind of stillness that once brought him comfort, that once wrapped around him like a shield against everything he had lost. Yet as he stood in his study, the faint glow of the fire casting shadows along the walls, he found no comfort in it, only a growing awareness that something had shifted beyond his control, something he could not simply command into stillness again. His gaze drifted, unbidden, toward the door at the far end of the room, the one he had not opened in years, the one that held everything he had chosen to leave behind. And for a long moment, he did nothing, his breath steady, his posture composed. Yet beneath it all, there was a tension he had not felt in a very long time, Not fear, not exactly, but something close enough to it to unsettle him. He told himself it was because of her, because of the servant who moved through his home as if it were not a place of endings but of beginnings, because she had spoken words that lingered where silence should have remained untouched, and he resented that, resented the way her presence had begun to reach places no one else had dared approach, even without trying. Yet as he stood there, alone, he understood something else, something far more dangerous than resentment. The realization that it was not her actions alone that had created this shift, it was his response to them. The hesitation he had not corrected, the silence he had allowed to stretch instead of breaking it as he once would have. And that knowledge unsettled him more than anything she had done. A sound broke through his thoughts then, soft but unmistakable, footsteps in the corridor beyond, unhurried, unafraid, and he knew without seeing that it was her, because no one else in this castle moved with that kind of quiet certainty. And before he could stop himself, before he could remind himself that it did not matter, he found himself moving toward the door, his steps slow, deliberate, until he reached it and paused, listening as the footsteps drew closer, then slowed, then stopped just outside. On the other side, Eliza stood still, her hand resting lightly against the wall as if she could sense the presence beyond it, as if she understood without being told that this was a place not meant to be approached. And yet she had not turned away, not immediately, not as the others would have done, and in that shared silence, separated only by a door neither of them crossed, something passed between them that required no words, something fragile and uncertain, yet impossible to ignore. Inside, Sebastian remained motionless, his hand hovering near the handle, closer than it had been in years, closer than he had ever allowed it to be. And for a single, fleeting moment, the thought crossed his mind, uninvited and dangerous, that perhaps the door was not the only thing that had been closed for too long, and that perhaps, just once, it could be opened. There are moments when the world seems to hold its breath, when something long buried begins to stir, not with force, but with a quiet insistence that cannot be ignored. And on the other side of that closed door, Sebastian Blackwood felt it more clearly than ever before, his hand still hovering near the handle, his thoughts no longer as steady as they had once been, because the presence beyond the door had not moved, had not retreated, and that stillness carried more weight than any demand ever could. Outside, Eliza Whitmore remained where she stood, her palm resting lightly against the cool stone wall, her gaze lowered not in submission, but in thought, as if she understood that this moment was not hers to control. And yet she did not leave, not immediately, because something in the silence told her that stepping away too soon would mean something had been lost before it had even begun. Inside, the Duke closed his eyes for the briefest moment, a rare gesture that betrayed the strain beneath his composed exterior, because the door before him was not simply wood and iron. It was everything he had chosen not to face, everything he had sealed away in order to continue breathing without truly living. And for years, that choice had been enough. It had protected him. It had kept the world at a distance. But now, for reasons he could not fully understand, that distance felt less like safety and more like confinement. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his fingers shifted closer to the handle, not enough to grasp it, not yet, but enough to acknowledge the possibility he had long denied. And in that small movement, something within him faltered, not broken, not undone, but no longer as unyielding as it had once been. Then, from the other side, Eliza's hand fell away from the wall, not abruptly, not in retreat, but with a quiet acceptance, as if she had sensed the limit of what this moment could hold. And without a word, without a glance back, she turned and walked down the corridor, her footsteps soft, steady, fading into the distance until the silence returned. Yet it was not the same silence that had existed before. Sebastian opened his eyes then, his hands still suspended in that fragile space between action and restraint, and he listened, not to the fading footsteps, but to what remained after them, the absence that no longer felt empty, the quiet that now carried the echo of something more, something that lingered even after she was gone. For a long moment, he did not move, and then, with a slow exhale he had not realized he was holding, his hand dropped away from the door, not in surrender, but in hesitation, because for the first time in years, he understood that opening it would not simply reveal the past, it would change the present. And as he turned back toward the dim light of his study, he carried with him a thought he could not silence, a question that had not existed before she arrived, and it followed him. With every step, quiet, persistent, and impossible to ignore. What if the door was not meant to remain closed forever? The next morning did not arrive with clarity, but with a quiet unease that settled into every corner of Blackwood Castle, as though the walls themselves had begun to remember something they were never meant to forget. And Sebastian Blackwood felt it the moment he opened his eyes, not as a thought, but as a presence, subtle and persistent, lingering beneath the surface of everything he did. He rose as he always had, with discipline, with control, yet there was a fracture in the routine now, something small but undeniable, because for the first time in years, his mind did not return immediately to duty, but to a door he had not opened and a silence that no longer belonged solely to him. Across the castle, Eliza Whitmore moved through the morning light with the same quiet purpose she had carried since the day she arrived. But there was a difference now, not in her actions, but in the way the space responded to her, as if the castle itself had begun to accept the changes she brought, the windows that remained open, the air that no longer felt untouched, the subtle warmth that existed where none had been allowed before, and she did not rush, did not force anything further, as if she understood that some things could not be undone quickly, only patiently. When Sebastian entered the lower hall, he found her near the long table once more. Though this time she was not adjusting candles or clearing dust, she was simply standing there, her gaze resting on the light that spilled across the floor, as if she were measuring something unseen, and for a moment, he did not speak, because there was something about the stillness of that moment that felt unfamiliar in a way he could not name. "You remain," he said finally, the words quieter than he intended, less a command and more an observation, and Eliza turned slightly at the sound of his voice, her expression calm, unchanged, yet there was a softness there now, something that had not been present before, not directed at him, but not hidden from him either. "I said I would, Your Grace," she replied, and there was no hesitation in her voice, no doubt, only a quiet certainty that settled into the space between them in a way that could not be dismissed. Sebastian studied her then, truly studied her for the first time, not as a servant, not as an interruption, but as something he did not yet understand, because she had stayed, not out of obligation, not out of fear, but by choice, and that distinction carried a weight he had not anticipated. "Most do not," he said after a moment, though he did not elaborate, did not explain what he meant, because he did not need to. The truth of it existed in every corner of the castle, in every empty room that had once held someone who chose to leave rather than remain within his silence. Eliza inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without questioning it, and then, without shifting her gaze from the light before her, she spoke again, her voice softer this time, as though the words were not meant to challenge, but simply to exist. "Perhaps they were not meant to," she said, and for a brief moment, the meaning of those words lingered just beyond his understanding, not fully formed, yet impossible to ignore. Sebastian felt it then, the shift he had resisted, not in the castle, not in the space around him, but within himself, a quiet recognition that unsettled him more than anything before it, because for the first time in years, he was no longer entirely certain that remaining unchanged was the same as remaining whole. Change does not announce itself with certainty. It arrives quietly, almost gently, until the moment a man realizes he can no longer pretend it is not there, and Sebastian Blackwood felt that realization settle deeper within him as the day unfolded, not as a sudden revelation, but as a steady awareness that refused to fade. The castle no longer felt like a place suspended in time. It felt as though something had begun to move again, slowly, cautiously, as if testing whether it was allowed to exist, and that shift followed him wherever he went, in the softened light that reached into corners once left in shadow, in the absence of that suffocating stillness he had once relied upon, and most of all, in the presence of the woman who had not left. Eliza Whitmore did not seek him out, did not force conversation or change, and yet her influence lingered in ways that could not be undone, and by late afternoon, he found himself walking not toward his study, not toward the solitude he had always chosen, but toward the West Wing, toward the place he had forbidden even himself to enter, his steps slower than usual. Not from hesitation alone, but from something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to intent. The corridor was as he had left it, untouched, silent, the air heavier than anywhere else in the castle, and at the end of it, the door remained closed, exactly as it had been for years, and for a long moment. He stood there, saying nothing, doing nothing, as if the act of simply being present was already more than he had allowed himself before. "You should not be here." His voice came low, measured, though not directed at himself, because she was there again, not too close, not intruding, simply standing a few steps behind, her presence quiet but undeniable, and when he turned, her expression held no surprise, no apology, only that same calm understanding that unsettled him more than resistance ever could. "I am not, Your Grace," she said softly, and for a brief moment, the words seemed contradictory, until he realized what she meant, that she had not approached the door, had not crossed the boundary he had drawn, she had only followed the path that led near it, and that distinction, small as it was, held more respect than obedience ever could. "You continue to test what is not yours to change," he said, though the sharpness in his tone had diminished, replaced by something far less certain, and Eliza lowered her gaze slightly, not in submission, but in thought, as if weighing her response carefully before offering it. "Some things do not belong to anyone," she replied, quietly, and the words lingered between them, not challenging, not forceful, but undeniable in their truth, because the door before him did not belong to power or position. It belonged to something far more fragile, something he had locked away not to protect others, but to protect himself. Sebastian turned back toward it then, his hand rising once more, closer this time. Close enough that the distance between his fingers and the handle felt smaller than ever before, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow to that single point, to the choice he had avoided for so long, and behind him, Eliza did not speak again, did not move, she simply remained, a presence that neither pushed nor retreated, and in that quiet, unwavering stillness, something within him finally gave way, not completely, not all at once, but enough for him to understand that the door would not remain closed forever, not anymore. There are decisions that divide a life into before and after, though in the moment, they feel no larger than a single breath. And as Sebastian Blackwood stood before the door he had not touched in years, he understood with quiet certainty that this was one of them, not because of what lay beyond it, but because of what it required of him to open it at all. His hand remained suspended, closer than it had ever been, the faint outline of the handle reflecting the dim light of the corridor, and for a moment, time itself seemed to slow, as if the castle waited with him, as if even the silence had drawn nearer to witness what he would do. Behind him, Eliza Whitmore did not move, did not speak, yet her presence was there, steady and unwavering, not urging him forward, not pulling him back, simply existing in a way that made retreat feel different than it once had, less certain, less inevitable. He had told himself for years that the past was something to be preserved untouched, that by closing this door he had maintained control, had kept grief contained within walls that could not reach him. But standing there now, he realized something he had not allowed himself to consider before, that the door had not only kept the past inside, it had kept him outside as well, separated from everything he had once been, from everything he might still become. Slowly, with a breath that felt heavier than it should have, his fingers closed around the handle, the cold metal grounding him in a moment he could no longer avoid, and for an instant, he hesitated, not out of fear alone, but out of the weight of what this choice represented, the acknowledgement that some things could not remain untouched forever, no matter how carefully they had been hidden away. Then, with a movement so slight it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, he turned it. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, yet it echoed through him more loudly than any noise he had heard in years, because it was not the opening of a door that unsettled him. It was the breaking of something far more enduring, the quiet certainty he had lived within for so long. The door did not swing wide, not all at once. It opened slowly, as if even the room beyond resisted the change, revealing only a narrow glimpse of what had been left behind. a space untouched by time, preserved in a stillness that felt almost sacred, and Sebastian did not step forward immediately. He remained where he was, his hand still on the handle, his gaze fixed on the threshold, as if crossing it required more than movement, as if it demanded something from him he was not yet ready to give. Behind him, Eliza's breath remained quiet, her presence unchanged, and though she could not see what lay beyond the door, she did not ask, did not move closer, because she understood without being told that this moment did not belong to her, that it was his alone to face. And yet, as the door stood open, even if only slightly, something within the castle shifted once more, something deeper than light or air or silence, something that could not be undone. Because for the first time in years, the past had been allowed to exist alongside the present, and Sebastian Blackwood could no longer pretend that one could remain without the other. There are rooms that do not belong to the present, rooms that exist only in memory, preserved not by time but by refusal, and as Sebastian Blackwood stood at the threshold, the narrow opening before him revealing fragments of a life he had sealed away, he understood with quiet certainty that stepping inside would not simply uncover what had been lost, it would confront everything he had chosen not to feel. The air beyond the door was different, still, untouched, carrying a faint trace of something that had not faded despite the years, and for a long moment, he remained where he was, his hand still resting against the door as if it were the only thing keeping him anchored, because once he crossed that boundary, there would be no returning to the man he had been before it opened. Behind him, Eliza Whitmore did not shift, did not speak, yet her presence lingered in a way that was impossible to ignore, not as pressure, not as expectation, but as something steady, something that did not demand he move forward, yet made standing still feel less certain than it once had. Slowly, with a breath that felt unsteady despite his control, Sebastian stepped across the threshold, the movement small, deliberate, yet heavier than anything he had done in years, and the room revealed itself not all at once, but in quiet pieces, a chair placed near the window, untouched, a table where dust had settled undisturbed, a faint outline on the wall where light once lingered longer, and in those details, there was no chaos, no destruction, only the stillness of something preserved too carefully, too completely, as if it had been waiting for him to return. He moved further inside, his gaze tracing the space slowly, not searching, not avoiding, simply allowing himself to see what he had refused to look at for so long. And with each step, something within him shifted, not breaking, not unraveling, but loosening in a way that felt both unfamiliar and necessary. At the center of the room, he stopped, his breath steady once more, though not as controlled as before. And for the first time in years, he did not turn away from the weight of what remained. He did not retreat into silence or distance. He simply stood there, allowing the past to exist without pushing it back into the shadows. Outside the room, Eliza remained in the corridor, her hands folded quietly before her, her gaze lowered not in submission, but in respect, because she understood that this moment was not hers to witness, not hers to interrupt, and yet she did not leave. Not completely, because something told her that stepping away entirely would mean abandoning a moment that had taken too long to arrive. Inside, Sebastian exhaled slowly, the sound quiet but real, and in that breath, there was something new, something that had not existed before the door had opened, not relief, not yet, but the beginning of something that could no longer be ignored, the understanding that the past did not have to remain untouched in order to be endured. And as he turned slightly, his gaze moving toward the doorway where he knew she still stood beyond sight, he did not call her name, did not speak at all, yet the silence between them had changed once again, no longer a barrier, but something far more fragile and far more alive. Some endings do not arrive with finality. They arrive with quiet understanding, with the soft realization that something has changed in a way that cannot be undone. And as Sebastian Blackwood stood within the room he had kept sealed for so long, he felt that understanding settle within him, not as a sudden release, but as a slow, steady shift that reached deeper than anything he had allowed himself to feel in years. The silence around him was no longer suffocating, no longer something to be endured. It had become something else entirely, something that held space rather than closing it. And for the first time since he had lost everything he once believed defined him, he did not turn away from it. He did not retreat. Instead, he stepped back toward the doorway, toward the present he had kept at a distance. And as he crossed the threshold once more, leaving the room open behind him, he did not close the door. Eliza Whitmore stood where she had remained, just beyond the line of sight, her posture still, her presence unchanged, and when he appeared, she lifted her gaze to meet his, not with expectation, not with relief, but with that same quiet steadiness that had never asked anything of him, and yet had changed everything. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because words would have diminished what had already been understood, and in that silence, something passed between them that did not require explanation, something fragile and new, yet certain in a way that could not be denied. Sebastian looked at her then, not as he had before, not as a servant who had disrupted his order, not as an intrusion he needed to correct, but as something else entirely, something he could not fully define. And for the first time, he did not resist that uncertainty. The castle around them felt different now, not transformed in any grand or sudden way, but altered in the smallest, most important details. The light that remained where it had once been shut out, the air that moved where it had once been still, the quiet that no longer felt empty. And in that subtle change, there was a promise he had not known he was waiting for. He turned slightly then, his gaze drifting back toward the open door, not with hesitation this time, but with acknowledgement, because what lay behind it was no longer something he needed to keep hidden in order to survive. It was something he could carry with him without being consumed. When he looked at her again, there was something in his expression that had not existed before, something unguarded, however briefly, and though he did not speak, did not offer words that might define what had begun, he did not look away either, and that alone was enough to change everything. And as the light from the open windows stretched further into the corridor, touching even the edges of the space that had once remained untouched, the silence that settled between them was no longer something that separated. It was something that held, something that allowed two wounded lives to exist side by side without fear of breaking. And in that quiet, unspoken understanding, the future did not feel like something to be endured, but something that might, at last, be lived.